We're very happy to start that off with a paper by Grace Yukich on forms of discrimination involving gender, race, and religion. Grace Yukich is an associate professor of sociology at Quinnipiac University. Her research focuses on issues related to immigration, religion, social movements, and race and ethnicity. She's held positions as a young scholar in American religion at Indiana University's Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture, and as a Religion and Public Life Fellow at Princeton University's Center for the Study of Religion. Yukich's first book, One Family Under God, Immigration Policies and Progressive Religion in America, is an ethnographic exploration into how immigration is changing the relationship between religion and politics in America. Through extensive field observations and interviews, the book reveals how immigration, especially from Latin America, has transformed religious activism in the U.S. In this book, Yukich demonstrates how activists have humanized the image of undocumented immigrants, revived support for the sanctuary of fugitives in houses of worship, and challenged the religious nationalism of religious right by portraying undocumented immigrants as fellow children of God. Yukich's second book project, a joint effort with Avi Aster at the University of Barcelona, examines discrimination against Arab Muslims in the United States and Spain. As in the paper for today, Yukich relies on experimental methods to explore discrimination against Arab American Muslims in the U.S. job and housing markets. In combination with Aster's research in Spain, the book will provide a comparative perspective on discrimination against Arab Muslims to understand how and why discrimination looks different in the two countries. Yukich is currently working on an additional project that studies social change efforts in Buddhist, Hindu, and Muslim communities in America. Her work examines how these communities rely on different activist strategies from Christian and Jewish communities, which tend to be the main focus of religious activism scholarship. Since congregations play a less central role in these less explored religious traditions, Yukich is performing interviews and ethnographic observations to understand how strategies other than congregation-based organizing are used by Buddhist, Hindu, and Muslim activists in America. The broad social relevance of Yukich's work has brought her scholarship into engagement with non-academic audiences. She has been a regular contributor to The Imminent Frame, the Social Science Research Council's blog on secularism, religion, and the public sphere. Yukich is also the founder and editor-in-chief of Mobilizing Ideas, a blog dedicated to fostering interactions between social movement scholars and activists. And we're grateful she's here with us this evening. And we're also grateful to have with us Will Schultz as our discussant today. Schultz recently received his PhD from Princeton in history and is currently a postdoctoral fellow here at the Mitchell Center. His dissertation, Garden of the Gods, Colorado Springs and the Origins of the Culture Wars, explores the relationship between religion and politics through a close examination of Colorado Springs, Colorado, which has been home to numerous evangelical ministries and as a result has played a crucial role in the American culture wars of the 1980s and 1990s. So thanks to both of you for being here today and welcome. As with our standard procedure, we'll begin by Professor Yukich beginning to give some remarks on her paper, followed by a discussion by Ms. Schultz, and then I'll take the cue for question and answer that follows. So thank you very much.
So thank you so much for that introduction, Jeff. And I also just want to say thank you to Heather Sharkey and to Roger Smith and to members of the planning committee for inviting me to come and participate in this series on states and religious freedom. And also thank you to Will Schultz for preparing some comments on the paper for today, and to all of you for being here. Thank you for coming. So as Jeff said, my name is Grace Yukich. I am here today to talk about some of my research on discrimination against Muslim Americans. And this particular piece is called Muslims Need Not Apply, Religious, Ethnic, and Gender Discrimination in the U.S. Labor Market. And I know some of you have read the paper, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. So, Muslims in America. It's a topic you never hear about these days. Of course, I'm joking. This is all over the news pretty much all the time. We have this lovely quote from our president. And of course, examples during the presidential campaign and after of Muslims in the news facing various forms forms of discrimination. So this is a topic that we hear about a lot, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it gets very careful treatment in research. And that's part of what I'm attempting to do with this study is spend some very careful and extensive time thinking about the types of discrimination that Muslims face in America today. So just some brief comments by way of introducing the paper for people that didn't have a chance to read it. Before 9/11, a lot of Americans hadn't really given that much thought to Muslims. Maybe they knew about the World Trade Center bombing, but other than that, maybe a lot of people didn't know Muslims and just hadn't really thought about Muslims very much in general. But of course, as we all know, after the attacks, Muslims became much more a part of public discourse in the United States. Hate crimes increased towards Muslims pretty drastically in the year or two following the attacks. But then after that, they eventually faded. And there wasn't as much discussion, particularly in 2008 and 2012 elections. The economy played more of a role in national debates. And it just moved out of the public spotlight a bit. But during that time, American attitudes towards Muslims remained very divided. And then in 2014, we have the kind of rise in international prominence of ISIS. And that really brought Muslims and particularly anti-Muslim discourse and sentiment back to the forefront of public discourse in the U.S., political discourse in the U.S., and really heightened a lot of anti-Muslim discrimination. So hate crimes started to go up again, attitudes about Muslims became more negative again, so we really see some examples in the literature of renewed fears among Americans about Muslim extremism following this. So that really was the backdrop for beginning this study in 2015. There have been lots of studies of discrimination against American Muslims, but as of 2015, given this sort of rise of ISIS, I was interested in seeing, what's going on now? What are Americans doing now? How is this affecting American Muslims' lives in this moment? And then, of course, so when I started the project, when I really conceived of the project in April and May of 2015, this was prior to the point that Donald Trump had even announced his candidacy as a candidate for president. It seems like, a world ago. And he announced, I believe, in June of that year. And then we actually started the research in September of that year. So it was right after he had announced his candidacy. It was before anybody was really taking him seriously as a candidate for president. And it was really before he'd made many public statements at all about Muslims as part of his campaign. So just to kind of give you a sense of the timeline of when the research started, and then when it ended in August of 2016. So by that point, Trump was the nominee for the Republican Party. He had said many things as part of his campaign, such as proposing his ban on Muslim entry to the United States. So I don't know how well you can see this chart, but there was a poll by NBC News. Do you favor or oppose Donald Trump's proposal to bar Muslims from entering the U.S.? And you can see the left light blue is people who say they favored the proposal, the dark blue is people who opposed the proposal, and then the gray was people who said they weren't really sure or didn't have an opinion. Of course, as is unsurprising, more Republicans said that they favored the ban than Democrats. But you can still see that quite a lot of Americans said that they approved of this ban. So maybe you were already aware of that, but those numbers remain very similar today. There's still quite a lot of support for that proposal among Americans. So this all happened while the study was occurring. And part of why I want to introduce that is I just want to let you know that I was aware that things were changing as the study was going on. And one of the things that we did as part of the analysis was some overtime analysis to see whether, for example, the ISIS attacks in Paris. People may remember the attacks where 130 people were killed by gunmen in nightclubs in Paris. That occurred in November 2015. So that was after the research has started. So we actually looked to see whether there were changes before those attacks, and then after those attacks in hiring discrimination towards Muslims to see whether that mattered, and we didn't find any over time differences. So in terms of American attitudes towards Muslims and Arab Americans, because the study is looking at both, there is a poll that has been done by Zogby in 2010, 2015, and 2017 as well. I'll mention something about 2017 in a minute. But leading up again to the study and when the study started, this is what the numbers look like in terms of American attitudes towards Muslim Americans and Arab Americans. So you can see that by 2015, and this was, again, before Trump, the attitudes had gotten much less favorable, right? So towards Muslim Americans, we went from a 48% of Americans saying they had favorable views to 33%, and among Arab Americans, from 49% saying they had favorable views to 40% of Americans saying they had favorable views of Arab Americans. So leading up to the study, I really wanted to understand what was happening with these drops in positive attitudes towards Muslims and Arabs in the U.S. Surprisingly, actually now, as of 2017, attitudes have become more favorable towards both groups. Maybe not what we would have expected. So of course, there's lots of laws against religious discrimination in the United States. The First Amendment, and then of course the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits hiring discrimination. And I wanted to look specifically at hiring because of the importance of economic integration for more general integration of immigrants in the United States. So not everybody, we didn't use immigrant status as one of the variables in our study, but many Arab Americans and many Muslim Americans in the U.S. are immigrants. So understanding what the barriers are to integration for immigrants is part of the background of the study as well. So we know that there has been a rising number of complaints of anti-Muslim discrimination in the workplace. So even though Muslims make up less than 2% of the American population, 25% of EEOC religious discrimination claims were made by Muslims in 2009. So again, this may be something that's not necessarily surprising, but important and something worth exploring. So part of the nice thing about audit studies is that it allows us to measure actual levels of discrimination and compare that to perceptions people have. That's not to say that perceptions of discrimination aren't important in and of themselves. People's perceived discriminations have all kinds of effects on their mental health and physical health, but it's still important to be able to measure actual levels of discrimination people are facing. So this study is responding to a theory in sociology of racial formation, the ways that racialization of different groups occur, and specifically the ways that racialization of different religious groups occurs. Thinking about the ways that we can better incorporate an intersectional framework into those theories, one specifically that recognizes gender. So gender and religion are mutually constitutive. It's really important that any study that considers race and religion also is thinking about gender. But a lot of studies on racial formation and the racialization of religion don't really theorize gender. So that's part of what I want to do here as well. So what did I do? For people that haven't read the paper, I used a correspondence audit method. So these studies have become very popular during the last decade. I used a correspondence method, which involves sending out resumes to actual job openings that are identical in every respect except for a few variables. And in this study, the resumes varied along 3 lines. One was the ethnicity of the applicant, and that was signaled by name, which I'll talk about more in a minute. The second was the gender of the applicant, and again, that was signaled by name. And then finally, the religion of the applicant. And that was signaled through college volunteer experience. So the area of the resume for recent college graduates that includes something like volunteer experience, since a lot of people don't have a lot of work experience at that point. And on that part of the resume, we would list, for example, I was treasurer of the Penn Muslim Student Association, right? So that's the standard way in this type of study of signaling religious identity. I sent out 1,000 resumes to 1,000 job openings. As the paper discusses, and we may talk more about in the discussion, I chose to send out one resume to each employer rather than to do matched pairs, which is sending out more than one resume to each employer, because there's research that suggests that doing that clues employers into what you're doing, that it can skew results. So even though it takes a lot longer to get a big sample size to do it the way that I did it, I took that more conservative approach to be certain that the discrimination I was seeing really was due to those variables. And then finally, I was interested in how social and institutional context shape the discrimination that different groups face. So I looked at geographic variation as well. I chose 2 cities in each of 4 regions. One kind of large local city, very cosmopolitan city, and then one kind of smaller regional city. And you can see what those were here on the slide. So I was interested really, as a Southerner, somebody that grew up in the South, I was interested in whether some of the kind of conservative, evangelical, negative attitudes towards Muslims, whether that translated into higher levels of discrimination against Muslims in the South. And as you'll see, it did not. That was one of the surprises of the study, for me at least. So these are the applicants by ethnicity, gender, and religion. You can see that there were 4 names that we used. Christopher Smith was our white male applicant. Yusuf Ahmed was our Arab male applicant. Jessica Smith was our white female applicant, and then Fatima Ahmed was our Arab female applicant. And then we varied religion for each of those applicants as well. We tested these names to make sure that they were signaling what we thought they were signaling for people who were receiving these applications using Mechanical Turk. So I don't know if people are familiar with Mechanical Turk. I did talk about it very briefly in the paper, but just to tell you a little bit more if anyone's unfamiliar with it. Amazon has a service called Mechanical Turk, where people all around the world can sign up as workers, and then people like us, researchers, can go on and offer people jobs for a set amount of money. And survey researchers have started to use this as a way to conduct surveys. There are a lot of articles that have been published that suggest that the sample is as representative as in standard survey research. So it's a way to get a relatively representative sample really quickly. The first time I did it, I was like, wow, I just got survey results in 10 minutes. That was amazing. So it's really, especially as an ethnographer, somebody that primarily uses ethnography, it was kind of crazy. So anyway, the point is that we used this to test whether the names were signaling what we thought by asking, what is this person's race or ethnicity, and then giving them the name, and then just seeing what people said without any other information. And over 90% of the time, white names were identified as white, and over 70% of the time, Arab names were identified as Arab. So just briefly, some of the basic findings, again, for people that may not have read the paper. This is what I found for callback rates for Muslims. This is not what I thought I would find at all, which was that there really wasn't a significant difference overall in callback rates for Muslims versus non-Muslims. So if we just looked at this, we would think, oh, well, I guess maybe Muslims don't face as much discrimination as we thought, or maybe it has something to do with the fact that this is the entry-level job market. Maybe other job markets would look different. Maybe black Muslims would have a different experience, right? Maybe one of those groups that's not in the study, who knows, right? But then, when you break it down by gender and ethnicity, you see a very different story. For white men, there's really not much of a difference. Being Muslim, or Christian, and I can say more in the discussion about why I included that if people are curious, doesn't really make a difference for callback rates for white men. But for everybody else, gender and ethnicity really matters, but matters in different ways from each other and in different ways than we might expect. So let me just give you a couple of quick examples. So this is callback rates for men on the left and then women on the right. And the kind of red bar is for Arab applicants and the yellow bar is white applicants. So you can see that Arab Muslim men have a much lower callback rate than pretty much everybody else. And that is in line with what we might expect, right? But there's other things that maybe we wouldn't expect. Like this category here for Arab Muslim women, where the difference really isn't statistically significant. And actually, just in raw numbers, Arab Muslim women are being called back more than white Muslim women. Which again, if we just used an additive approach to understanding discrimination, that is not what we would expect. So again, there's a lot in the paper, a lot more than that one chart, but that just gives you one example of what I'm doing in the paper for people that haven't read it. Just to summarize some of the basic findings. Arab Muslim men have the lowest callback rate, so we can think about the ways that stereotypes about terrorism might be affecting people's job prospects. But white Muslim women actually face the biggest penalty for being Muslim of any group in the study. And that was a surprise for me. That was not what I would have expected. And we can talk more about why that might be the case. And then again, a surprise was that Arab Muslim women actually had a slight advantage in this particular job market. And I believe that that's because of stereotypes about Arab Muslim women being submissive, and that the entry-level market in particular actually wants people that are relatively submissive and aren't going to be challenging their managers. So thinking about the ways that social and institutional context shape the types of discrimination people face is important. And then finally, we can talk more, of course, about the policy implications of this and the implications for research. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts. The only thing that I want to just mention before we talk is that the study that I'm conducting now as a follow-up to this study is a similar study on Airbnb to, again, look at a different social and institutional context and the ways that discrimination might look different in that context. And then also, one of the reasons I wanted to do this was to see whether images make a difference. Airbnb requires that any user includes a picture of themselves. So we have created fictitious profiles of Airbnb users, and for women in particular, some women, their bio says they're Muslim and they're veiled, and other women, their bio says they're Muslim and they're not wearing the hijab. So seeing whether it matters whether someone is a hijabi, or whether, you know, if you're Muslim but you don't wear the hijab, it's fine, you know, and seeing the ways that that might matter in ways that the hiring study couldn't really measure is what I'm doing now. So I will stop there and turn things over to Will.
Well, first, again, thanks to everyone who made both this particular event and this event series possible, especially Professor Green and Professor Sharkey and the steering committee. Thanks to all of the audience for being here. And most important, thanks to Professor Yukich for this paper. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to comment on it and hopefully contribute in some way. So, recognizing the bare existence of prejudice in society may not be much of a challenge to simply recognize it exists, but Professor Yukich tackles a much harder problem. Measuring prejudice and then using those measurements to explore its nature and causes. Now, quantifying prejudice has a long tradition in the social sciences. One example, to prepare for this comment, I skimmed Gordon Allport's 1954 classic, The Nature of Prejudice, and in the first chapter, he cites the example of a Canadian social scientist named S.L. Wax, who sent 2 letters, one signed Mr. Lockwood, the other signed Mr. Greenberg, to hotels and resorts asking for a room. And I will let you guess which name got more responses. Now, Professor Yukich's basic approach is the same, but her method is much more sophisticated, and her findings are more complex. As I interpret it, and as she has explained it here, the key finding is that the identifier Muslim is not as simple as it seems. Neither entirely a religious, racial, or ethnic adjective, it nonetheless has elements of all 3 categories. And it intersects with gender, local context, and social structure to produce sometimes surprising results. Professor Yukich's intersectional approach pushes us to consider the varieties of anti-Muslim prejudice, challenging the assumption that all Muslims experience discrimination the same way. Muslim, she shows, is not a unitary category, and neither is prejudice. Now, this is an important study, and it should be as widely read as possible. So with that in mind, I'll discuss 5 points that I think Professor Yukich could elaborate on in order to expand the potential audience for this study. Now, first is the psychology of prejudice. I don't think it's going too far to suggest that this study is less about identity than about identifications, the ways in which employers stamp Muslim applicants with certain assumptions based on their religion, their race, or their gender. It's less about the experience of the applicants, who are, in this case, names on paper, and more about the decision-making process of the employers. So my question, is there some widely accepted psychological theory of prejudice which explains the chain of reasoning behind this kind of multifaceted discrimination? It would have to account for why employers are triggered by some combinations of attributes, but not others. Answering this question would help us peek inside the black box of the hiring process, which is always one of the more mysterious parts of these audit studies, how these employers work, how they make their decisions. Second, racialization. I think this term needs a more precise definition in this case. To say religious categories like Muslims are racialized suggests racial prejudice is qualitatively different than prejudice based on other attributes like religion. And I think this is probably true, but I also think it would be hard to find a case in American history where religious prejudices were not mingled with racial stereotypes. I think you could draw some very interesting parallels between anti-Muslim prejudice today and earlier experiences of Catholics and Jews in the United States. They too were marked with stereotypes that mixed racial and religious assumptions. There's in fact a voluminous social scientific literature from the early decades of the 20th century on the exclusion of Jews from the workplace. So if the contemporary treatment of Muslims is comparable, what does this suggest about the prospects for the acceptance of Muslims in American society in the near and more distant future? Addressing this parallel could pique the interest in particular of historians who might otherwise not have much time for what they would see as quantitative social science work. Third is Donald Trump, the very stable elephant in the room. So, as Professor Yukich said, this study was conducted in the midst of the Trump campaign. As to how this might have influenced findings, the answer seems obvious. Trump boosted anti-Muslim prejudice, but as we saw in some of the findings, Muslims were not significantly discriminated against in the hiring process. Discrimination became evident only when religion intersected with race and gender. So could this finding give us a more nuanced understanding of Trump's appeal? It might be worth revisiting his rhetoric to see whether it was, in its own way, intersectional, to see if he singled out particular categories within the Muslim community for abuse, and if and how his condemnation of Muslims intersected with his attacks on other groups, of which there was no shortage. So, fourth is methodological assumptions, which comes with the very important qualifier that I'm a historian and not a social scientist in any way. So, as I understand it, audit studies often use matched pairs, as you said, submitting at least 2 resumes to each job opening to check differential rates of response. As Professor Yukich said, in this case, they went for 1 application per job opening to make it less likely employers will realize they're being studied. But if it eliminates this problem, it seems that it might raise another, namely that a lot hinges on the uniformity of the employers to which the applications are being sent. If even a couple employers are significantly more or less choosy than the average, it might skew the results. So I'm wondering, if you could provide some elaboration on what led you to make that trade-off, and whether there's any way to factor in that potential complication. So fifth is the big picture. Audit studies are effective at identifying discrimination in the labor market, but as the beginning of the paper notes, anti-Muslim discrimination comes in many forms, not only in hiring, but also in hate crimes, and state-sponsored discrimination like racial profiling and travel ban. So how do these findings contribute to our understanding of these other forms of prejudice? In particular, I wonder if an intersectional perspective might suggest different places of looking for and different ways of measuring discrimination. Related to that, I was also curious about the policy recommendations. It seems intersectionality poses a special challenge here, as it's not always clear where interventions would do the most good. The results are surprising, as Professor Yukich noted, and there are all kinds of possibilities for unintended consequences. So I said this final topic was the big picture, but really all of my comments have been about the big picture, and I pointed to that because the study itself is so finely done that there's really not all that much I can add to it. I'm glad to have had the opportunity to make a few comments, though, and I'm sure we'll have an excellent conversation for the rest of the afternoon.
Sure, I can. So I won't respond to everything that we'll raise, just because I'm sure that other people might have some similar questions or points of discussion. So I'll save some of it for later. The couple of things I wanted to respond to now, just so that it can kind of shape what we do discuss. One is this question about Trump and the way that Trump may have shaped the results. Will sent me his comments ahead of time, which I really appreciated. And one of the reasons I mentioned that overtime analysis in my introductory comments is because of that question Will raised, which I think is a really good question about, how did the kind of changing national context as a result of Trump's candidacy and then presidency, how did that shape potentially the results that we were finding? And that was one of the reasons that we did conduct some analysis, basically using a variable for time, looking at before November 2015 and after November 2015. The reason we use that as a divider is that is when Trump first made the announcement that he wanted to create a Muslim registry and propose a ban on Muslims. That all happened in the aftermath of the attacks in Paris. So the idea was that perhaps before that, people's ideas about Muslims weren't kind of triggered, and then after the attacks by ISIS and Trump's comments, perhaps people either felt more animosity towards Muslims or more identification with Muslims. So for people that felt like they needed to come in defense of Muslims or were outraged by the things that Trump said. So that was why we kind of used that as a point in time to break things off and looked at whether there were differences before and after and did not find those differences. That doesn't mean that Trump isn't having an effect, right? Of course he's having some kind of effect. It just means it's not evident how that might be affecting callback rates, and that perhaps people who have anti-Muslim attitudes and then people that consider themselves allies of Muslims are kind of both changed to become both more negative and more positive, and that may have way canceled each other out. I don't know, but that was what we found with that analysis. In terms of the psychological theories, I think that's a really good question. I don't know if there are any psychologists in the room. I mainly focused on sociological theories of discrimination, but I know there are some psychological theories and drew on some of those, particularly about backlash effects. So part of the way that I try to explain why white women in particular had such a penalty for being Muslim was the expectations that a lot of Americans have about white femininity, and the expectation that it's performative and that it's sexualized, and that by rejecting that, if people assume that someone is veiling, right, who's Muslim, by rejecting that and adopting a more kind of modest notion of femininity, that's actually agentic, right? That it's showing agency, and that employers might not like that. They might want somebody that isn't likely to buck the norms or to demonstrate their agency, particularly in an entry-level job market. So there's quite a bit of psychological research about that I draw on a little bit in the paper, but not too much, just because the truth is that quantitative research, we know that these are the callback rates, but I can really only speculate why these callback rates might differ, right? I don't know for sure. It's really a point for future research. So that's why I didn't go into too much detail about that. But if other people have ideas about some of that, I'd love to hear them. And then maybe I'll stop there, because Will raised a lot of good questions, and I'd love to hear other people's thoughts as well.
Again, if you have a question to ask, just send me a sign and I'll add you to our queue. But we'll start with Heather.
I enjoyed the paper a lot, and I have a few questions broad. I'm still confused about some of the basic terms in the papers, and in the paper. Your distinction between Arabs and Asians. I don't quite understand that, since a third of Arabic-speaking peoples come from Asia. Arabs as whites. My understanding is, I think in the 1970s, one branch of the U.S. government said that when Arabs come into the United States, they should identify themselves as whites. I've been looking at Penn's PhD applications this week. It's still on there that they're supposed to fill in the white bubble, which causes a lot of frustration there. So I don't understand Arabs and whites. And the term white Muslims also confused me, because as I read the paper, I think you were referring to Anglo people with English Anglo names who converted, but I didn't know if you were referring to like Albanian immigrants, or I didn't know what white meant. So if you could clarify Arab, Asian, and white.
Yeah, no, those are great questions. And I mean, these are terms that are contested all the time, right? So that I have a footnote somewhere in the paper that talks about the kind of history of the contestation of the kind of Arab designation on the census, for example, in ways that has changed over time. And so, I mean, that's kind of the first thing that I'll say, is just that these terms are contested, and that they're obviously socially constructed categories. And so all I can do is just say how I'm using them in this paper. Not to say that those are necessarily the right ways of defining these terms. So in the paper, I'm using Arab to refer to the specific countries that the United States Census identifies as Arab countries. It's an arbitrary designation, really. And you're right, there is a point in the paper where I think the distinction I make with Asians is the one about kind of the background of American Muslims specifically.
And South Asians, except many of them are likely to have Arabic names. You would have somebody from Pakistan named Yusuf Ahmed.
That's right, exactly. So there's some overlap there, but and the name designation obviously could signify for some people a South Asian person rather than someone from, say, Syria, right? So there's no way for me to be sure about how people are identifying specific countries in this case. It's more just this kind of broad category of people who are from, again, the definition I'm using is these nations that the U.S. Census designates as Arab countries. So that's the way that I did it. I'm curious to hear if other people have thoughts about whether there's another definition that I should be using. And then in terms of Arabs as whites, yes, that's definitely a complication in terms of race versus ethnicity. So it's one of the reasons I think right now, I'd love feedback on this. Right now in the paper I use this discussion, racialization of religion, but I'm talking about Arab as an ethnicity, not a racial group, or an ethnic group, not a racial group. And so that there is a complication there. My understanding is that, at least on the US Census, that there are people who identify ethnically as Arab, but racially as white, right? So I mean, I think there's room for that to be the case in this study as well, that there might be people who identify racially as white, but have these Arab-sounding names. But I still think it's important to differentiate between, because I think employers do, right? And we see from the study that employers do, between names that have Arab origins, even if the person identifies racially as white, and people whose names have origins that are not Arab. They may not be white origins, I don't even know what that would mean, right, in terms of ethnic origin, but they're names that are identified by people as white names of white people. So that's for this study, that's the designation that matters, but again, I mean, yes, there's this complication of ethnicity versus race, and there's plenty of Arab people who identify racially as white. And then finally, white Muslims, yes, so at least in this study, I don't know if employers are assuming that all people with white-sounding names that have Muslim on their resume are converts. My guess is that probably a lot of employers do assume that they're converts, but I mean, they wouldn't necessarily have to be, right? There could be people with white-sounding names that were raised Muslim. There are people who fall into that category, but I think most of the research shows that most are converts, and so my guess is that probably most employers would assume that, but I don't know for sure since we didn't measure that. But yeah, thanks for the questions.
Thank you. Can I ask you a little bit more about regionality? Because you said that you didn't find a large difference between the North and the South. And I may be wrong, I may not have read it, but the two southern examples were Atlanta and Birmingham. And so my question is, I mean, do you think that changes when we look at different areas of the South, and those fairly large liberal cities? And also that question on a larger scale, I mean, I think the majority of your examples were cities. Do you think the kind of what we're seeing is going to change dramatically if we look at the difference between urban and rural?
So yes, that's a great question. We did not look at more rural areas because there's so few jobs, right? So the difficulty is that that you wouldn't be able to. It would be harder for employers not to catch on to what you're doing because there would be fewer applicants in the job pool to begin with for those rural jobs. And then also there's just too few jobs for you to really get a good sample size. So that's the main reason that we didn't do something like that. But yes, my expectation is that you would find differences between urban areas and rural areas. What we did find, we didn't find regional differences, but what we did find is between the large, more cosmopolitan cities and the more regional cities, differences in callback rates for Arab candidates, not for Muslim candidates. So this is in the paper, but not in what I presented today. But for Arab candidates, they were less likely to be called back in the smaller cities than they were in the really large cities, the kind of more cosmopolitan cities. So my guess is that, again, my hypothesis would be that same pattern would hold if we were to look at more kind of rural areas or suburban areas. In terms of the South, if we looked at other cities, I don't know if we would find something else if we looked at other cities in the South. It's definitely possible. I chose Atlanta and Birmingham because both Georgia and Alabama have very high evangelical Christian populations. And evangelical Christians in polls are the ones who express the most concern about Muslims. And so that's why I looked at those states and cities in those states to see whether that might be the case. We did look at jobs that were in kind of the wider metro area for all of these cities. So to use Birmingham as an example, I grew up in Alabama, and Birmingham's metro area is not very liberal. So if people followed the recent special election in Alabama, I don't know if you did, but you may have, like me, been kind of watching to see what would happen. And you may have noticed that there were certain counties, right? Jefferson County, which is most of the kind of main kind of central part of Birmingham, was in Jefferson County, was very blue in the election. But most of the surrounding counties were very red. And so the study included that kind of larger metro area as well to hopefully pick up on some of that perhaps more conservative sentiment.
Was there distinctions between the kind of metropolitan area and the centre?
We weren't able to do that kind of analysis. Yeah, I wish that we could. It would have been interesting to find out. But
Thank you.
thanks for the question.
I'll ask you a question myself now. And I want to begin by just agreeing with the complimentary things that Will said about your paper. It's very clear and informative and hopefully raises a lot of issues for us. One question, though, that I do have is, it seems as if there may be a slight tension between how you tend to treat most people as being, who have a lower rate of being called back as being penalized. So, as you say, Arab Muslim men are the most penalized, having less than 10% callback. White women who are Muslim are penalized 10% or more so. But then when it comes to the people who get the most callback, white women with no religious statement, you don't say, well, these women benefited the most. They were the least penalized. You suggest that they were discriminated against too, in a way, because you say, well, the jobs for which they were applying in all these cases were, as you say on page 21, low status, low paying occupations that are more typically occupied by women. And then on page 26, you repeat the similar idea that these jobs require submissive, low prestige work, as you're surmising. And so it seems as if that idea, to me, potentially destabilizes the overall set of findings, because if we could believe that these jobs are desirable, then yes, when people are not being called back, then they're being penalized. But if they are undesirable, then that challenges to some degree the force of the finding. Why not simply say that white women with no religious background were benefited the most, and other groups that have near that 25% callback rate?
That's an interesting point. And yes, I guess I do see most of these jobs as less desirable than some other jobs. And I think probably most of the applicants would prefer to work in higher paying jobs where they had more autonomy. But that said, I mean, it's an interesting point that some of the wording about the advantage that white women without any religious background have could be more nuanced and recognize that they do have an advantage in these particular markets, and they definitely do. I mean, even compared with white men, the raw callback rates are higher for white women than they are for white men with no religion listed. There's not a statistically significant difference there, but still it's clear that there's, that they have a great advantage in these particular markets compared to, say, Arab Muslim men. So, so yeah, thank you for that comment, because that's something that, that I think I could work to better discuss in the paper.
I actually was going to ask about oh no, Gabriel stole my question. Steve stole my question. My question was about citizens.
So we'll move to Washington.
Well, thanks for the paper, and it stimulated some thoughts for me about the race-religion relationship that I want to get your reactions to. And I want to know if the further study will look at Black Muslims in particular, because you began by saying, I think correctly, that there wasn't a lot of strong anti-Muslim sentiment at the forefront of the consciousness of most Americans prior to 9/11. But some have argued that the one exception to that is Black Muslims, and that they've had negative images amongst many white Americans at any rate, at least since the 1950s, and perhaps going back to the 1930s. And we have arguments about what forms of discriminatory attitudes are most fundamental, but the idea that white versus Black prejudice is the deepest and most enduring has a fair amount to be said for it. And arguably your results are consistent with that, because if it's clear it's a white Muslim, or if we presume that the employer interprets it as a white Muslim, there appears to be no penalty. So if racial privilege outweighs religious concerns, so it appears in the case of men. And then when you turn to women, white women might be presumed to be Muslim or sharply penalized. You interpret that plausibly enough as, well, maybe that suggests that they have too much agency and they're not right with these submissive jobs. Maybe that's part of it. But there is also an argument that white Muslim women might be perceived as marrying outside the race. And even though attitudes against that have greatly diminished, it might still be part of what's driving the phenomenon. And putting those things together, your findings give me the impression that maybe race is more deeply constitutive amongst the features of intersectionality than religion in shaping discrimination.
Yeah, thanks for that. So the next study is looking at Black Muslims. So one of the things that I found as I was working on this study and talking about it with other people, and was that people always had this question, well, what about Black Muslims? Which I thought was a good question, and mainly I just said, well, I was already looking at so many things in this study, I couldn't add another variable. But the next study, we are looking at Black Muslims as well as white and Arab Muslims, because like you, I am curious to know whether Black Muslims face similar levels of prejudice or different levels of prejudice, whether gender works differently for Black Muslims than it does for other groups of Muslims. And I honestly don't know what that will find, but we are including that in the current study on Airbnb.
Okay, Melissa, were you on? Michelle?
I really enjoyed this paper and talk, so thank you. So I have two comments, and they might not be things you can respond to right now, but I just want to throw them out there. So the first is in your conclusion, and sort of what you talked about was kind of Americans didn't have these negative stereotypes of Muslims before 9/11, and kind of linking the results that you found to kind of people seeing an Arab name and assuming they're Muslim. But I actually think Arab groups and media scholars would disagree with that from, Arabs have been portrayed as terrorists long before 9/11. So I actually think that you kind of conflating these two things is, the effects that we're finding for an Arab name is anti-Muslim sentiment is maybe not, well, you certainly can't say it with these data, but I think, thinking about I saw watching Air Force One as a kid, right? Just a number of movies where the villains, where the terrorists are Arabs. I think there's, you know, so just like keeping that, I don't think we're quite at a point where we can say that they have become one and the same. And then the other thing, you said that you're not a psychologist, and I should say neither am I at all, but I do spend a lot of time reading psychology literature. And so one thing I just wanted to point out is, right, so you're this Arab, white, your gender and your race/ethnicity is being determined at the name, right, at the outset, whereas your person is signaled farther down in an activity. And so, you know, we know from work like Jonathan Haidt and kind of moral psychology is that we have these intuitions or gut reactions, and we decide if we like someone within 5 seconds of meeting them, and then we have confirmation bias, and all these psychological tricks come into play that we then become very confident in our decision. And so if a psychologist was reading this paper, they might say, well, you're not actually randomizing all 3 things at once. You're randomizing 2 things and then later introducing something else. And I actually think your Airbnb stuff could help that a lot, because you're seeing pictures and names at the same time. And so that could be a nice, so I'm saying, I don't think that you necessarily have an answer to that right now, but I don't think that it's a insurmountable problem, but something to be aware of. And then when you're maybe writing up the Airbnb paper, whether it's a separate paper or if this is part of a book, but thinking about how people experience information initially, and then how that translates into how they internalize new information.
Yeah, thanks for that. Definitely. In the earlier versions of the paper, I said something like, oh, look, it means that discrimination against Arabs might be even greater than discrimination against Muslims. And then several people pushed back in exactly the way that you just did. And I was like, yes, you're exactly right. So that's one of the reasons that I put that out. That yes, there might be employers who see the name and then just ignore the rest of the resume, right? And I think there probably are some who, for whom that's the case, or who see the name and they look at the rest of the resume, but they've already made their decision just based on the name, right? So we can't really treat the way that Muslim is being signaled as equal in salience to the way that ethnicity and gender is being signaled, and there's just not really a great way around that, unfortunately, except like you said, maybe we'll help with that, I don't know. But it's one of the reasons why I backed off any claims like that about Arab discrimination being more prevalent than discrimination against Muslims, because they are being signaled in really different ways. I think that's a really important comment. And then the other thing is just that one of the things that I think does show that people are, at least many employers are at least noticing that Muslim designation, that they are at least reading through and seeing it, is that we see that, for example, for white men, being Muslim doesn't make any difference. And at first I was like, well, maybe employers just aren't seeing that they're Muslim. Maybe they're just not noticing that designation. But then for white women, because there was that huge difference, it's clear that there is something, right, that's leading to for Muslim women to being called back so much less often than white women that didn't have Muslim on their resume. So to me, that served as evidence that employers were reading through the resume and seeing that person was Muslim, at least for the white candidates. For the Arab candidates, maybe not, and that might be one reason that for a lot of the Arab candidates being Muslim didn't matter as much, because maybe employers were seeing that Arab name and then just saying, oh, nope, and putting it in the no file. So thank you for that comment. I think that probably did matter to some extent in the study, and it's just hard to know exactly how much.
My question is a little different, and forgive me if you have this with me, because I didn't change the finish reading. I'm curious about, when you've got the names and you're changing them all this, who's stated as a U.S. citizen and who's not? Because I think that might be kind of an interesting way to sort of parse this out in a different kind of way. Because I think, before Trump, maybe the immigration question wasn't so big, and maybe after Trump, immigration was a very big question.
Yeah, so we didn't include anything about the person's immigration status on the resume, in part because there were just already so many moving parts for the study. Yeah. Although that would be an interesting addition.
Yeah, I was thinking about like a regular application asking, are you a U.S. citizen?
I see, yes.
You know, do you not, you know, are you not a U.S. citizen, do you have a visa, do you not?
Yeah, so for the study, we used Indeed.com and CareerBuilder.com as the two places where we searched for jobs and then submitted resumes. And one of the things that was initially really frustrating is that some of the jobs, all you had to do was submit a resume, and we're done. Other jobs, you would hit, submit a resume, and it would take you to an external site for the employer. And then they wanted you to fill out their whole, long application. So you couldn't just submit a resume. So what we decided to do after kind of doing a pilot study was to still apply for some of those jobs, because most of the jobs were ones that required a little bit additional, but to be very careful about which information we would submit. So we would only submit information that was already on the resume anyway, so that we weren't, adding additional variables. Or also we decided that if they would ask us about criminal record or about whether we had legal permission. So I don't think it would ever ask if you were a citizen, but it would ask, do you have legal permission to work in the U.S.? So basically, they wanted to know, did they have to pay to get a visa for you, right? And anytime that those questions were asked, we would always say no to the criminal record question and yes to the legal status question. So that's what we did. And what that meant is we could do comparisons between the employers that didn't have that additional information, right? So employers that maybe assumed that any person with an Arab-sounding name didn't have legal permission to work in the U.S., right? And then employers that had the information that actually this person does have permission to work in the U.S. Whether they're an immigrant or not, they do have permission. And then we could see, were there differences in callback rates based on whether the employer had that information about the candidate or not. And we found that there weren't differences. I mean, again, something where we thought there would be. Now, I will say that it was only a small percentage of the employers that asked for that information. So if we had a larger sample of those employers, maybe the results would have been different. I don't know, but.
And I've got a question about the other study that you just started, the Airbnb study. I'm curious, if you're going to look at Black people in the Airbnb study, you compare those names up with what they call ethnic sounding names, right? Because that's always another thing. I mean, I've just seen so much stuff about Airbnb about, somebody getting, taken away because, they don't see them or they look at them and they don't think they're this, and then they get there and they're like, no, we're not going to listen to you.
We are.
Okay.
We are using more ethnic sounding names.
Okay.
Yeah. So, we just made a choice about that because we could have done both. We could have used names that weren't as ethnic sounding and the ones, but basically the study, again, is already so huge because I think we have 15 or 17 different guest profiles or fictitious profiles. So we just had to make a decision. And the reason that we decided to use those names was because we wanted to see whether we wanted to be able to more easily compare the Black Muslim candidates to the Arab Muslim candidates. So we're using very similar names for the two.
And then last little question about that, are you just having them trying to rent, or are you having them being, people who are out of their homes?
We're just having them try to rent. So what we do is we send out inquiries to hosts, in particular, so we're using the same cities, and we send out inquiries to the hosts to just say, like, hey, can I stay at your place for these dates, and see what response they get. So do we get any response at all? And if we do get a response, how warm is that response? So for example, there have been, one of the things that I found so far that I was like, oh, that's interesting, is that only the Arab candidates have gotten responses from employers explaining to them how Airbnb works. No other candidates have, but the Arab Arab guests have gotten several responses from employers that are being like, oh, let me explain to you how Airbnb works, which I thought was interesting. So I think we will have some interesting findings from the study. I'm just not sure what they'll look like yet.
Thank you.
Hi, Grace. Hi. I also think that the paper stripped of the study is great. Could you go back to the graph?
Tell me which one.
The figure 1 in the paper? I'm not sure if you have the exact same figures.
Maybe?
I can't see. Yeah. Because I'm struggling with this white female Muslim hit, and I guess there are a couple questions embedded in this. So first, let me say, the first one's simple, which is, so why didn't you include Christian women? Because I think that would really give us information, although it really didn't, I mean, it gave us information for the men, which was that they don't care. I think that would really hit on your submission argument if they were, actively evangelical Christian. So I would like to see that, especially for the Airbnb study, I guess, is what's next. And then, I've been struggling with, so why would white females have so much more of a penalty than white males who claim to be Muslim? And I wonder if it's partly related to the fact that white females are more desirable for these jobs, and therefore the employers actually, in terms of what Michelle said, they're giving those female resumes more time. So they're actually noticing religion more for the women than they are for the men. Which, again, you can address with the Airbnb study by signaling religion earlier. I'm not sure how you're going to signal evangelical Christianity on Airbnb, though.
We just have to do it in the bio. Yeah. So we can't do it. I don't know if there's a great way to do it in a photograph. I mean, I suppose if someone had like a huge cross or something. But we're doing it in the bio. So like for Arab Muslim women that aren't veiled, it'll say in their bio that they're Muslim. So yeah, I mean it's still a similar downside to what Michelle drew out, where like it's possible that hosts will notice that because they won't read their bio, they'll just look at their picture. But yeah, that's where we'll include that information. Yeah, I think your question about so to your first question about why we included Christian for men and not for women, I wasn't super interested in measuring discrimination against Christians in the study. The reason that I included that category for Christian was to kind of test whether if, for example, Arab Muslim men were facing a penalty for being Muslim, was it because people were assuming, for Arab men who didn't have Muslim listed, who just had no religion listed at all, were people assuming that they were Muslim? And was that creating a lower callback rate for them? And if someone was listed as Christian, the idea was that if they had a higher callback rate than the person with no religion listed, then it may be because the employers were assuming the person was Muslim, right? And then once Christian was on the resume, then they were like, oh, okay, well they're not that kind of Arab person, right? So that was why we included it for the men, which is like as a test to see whether that could partly explain any discrimination that Arab candidates faced, that they were it was being assumed that they were Muslim. And we found that there wasn't really a difference, which again was not what we expected. So in fact, Arab Christian male candidates were called back at this very slightly lower rate, not statistically significant, but so that wasn't what we found. So, but that was why we included it, and that's why we didn't include it for women, is we just really wanted to include it as this test to see whether employers were assuming that Arab candidates were Muslim. It would have been great to include Christian for women too. Now, in hindsight, now that we found that that submission might be playing, or ideas about submission might be playing a role in employers' reactions, I wish I could go back and redo it. But yeah, oh well. But perhaps on Airbnb there will be a way to do that. And if you have any thoughts about that, I'd love to hear back.
Oh, thanks.
Really enjoyed the paper. I do early American history, so I don't get to do too many correspondence audits. The questions I had are similar to ones Jeff asked and a couple others, and they had to do with the jobs themselves. And there's a question of the desirability of the jobs and how that factors in. Could you say, I know you mentioned it a little bit in the paper, what kinds of jobs these are, kind of customer service things?
Yeah, sure.
Could you talk a little bit more about those? How you came to choose those? What is that a factor at all, and how it affects the outcomes with choosing other types of jobs, affect the outcomes differently?
Yeah, sure. So the jobs were customer service jobs. The reason that I chose to focus on the entry-level job market was because I wanted to be able to signal Muslim identity using volunteer experience. Most recent college graduates, it makes sense to include that kind of experience on their resume, but they may not have a lot of work experience yet. So they needed to be able to apply for jobs where not a lot of work experience was required. And again, for a lot of the jobs, at least on these websites, places that were kind of higher status or higher paying jobs usually required more work experience. So that was why we chose that particular type of job to submit applications to. And there were also a few other studies that had been done recently that did a very similar type of application process, and we wanted to be able to compare our findings to those findings. That was another reason. There were lots of different types of jobs that fall under this customer service category. So there were jobs with banks, like being a teller in a bank. There were jobs that were sort of fast food service type of jobs. There were, jobs working at Starbucks. So there were those sorts of jobs that really were kind of pretty low status, low paying, didn't require a lot of experience. And then there were jobs, for, like I said, financial institutions, places like that were maybe slightly higher status, higher paying jobs. So there was a variety in the study. I have toyed around with the idea of including a variable that tries to capture something about the type of job to which people were applying, but haven't gotten around to that yet. But if that's something that people think would be really interesting to see, maybe it would be worth the time to do that. Is that all that you asked about? Yeah. Okay, great.
I'll interject. This is a very careful and work of social science that is trying not to say things that can't be shown and is very admirably constrained by what is empirically the case. But we care about this information for reasons that exceed our commitment to fact. We care about this information because we're citizens in a democratic regime. Here we are in a democratic democracy center where these results are showing that there is lack of fair equality of opportunity based on these intersectional problematics that you're exposing. And I wonder if you could take a moment to reflect on some of the broader implications of your findings and your ongoing research. Beyond this being seemingly a wonderful illustration of intersectionality in action, for the broader citizens among us who have an extra academic interest in these issues, I wonder if you had some sense of what maybe some of the policy consequences of this type of research might be, or what your research having to do with comparing Spain and the U.S. you might anticipate showing. Because those seem to me to be some of the bigger picture issues that would be of interest to academics and non-academics alike.
Yeah. I think the implications in some ways are encouraging. A lot of the public rhetoric that we hear about Muslims is damaging in and of itself, right? We know that words matter, and that makes people feel alienated, and that in and of itself is very damaging. And yet, the results like this suggest that negative attitudes that people report in polls or things that are said in public life don't necessarily always translate into negative treatment of all Muslims. For example, we see white men who are Muslim not necessarily facing that same level of scrutiny. So to me, that was encouraging. And yet, we also still see plenty of discrimination, right? So that is disheartening. I think I expected to find really, really high levels of discrimination and didn't find quite as high as I expected, so that, I guess, is positive. And yet, there's still so much discrimination that obviously is really, really troubling and disturbing. So in terms of possible policy implications, one of the things that I think the study reminds us is that different groups of Muslims are thought about in very different ways from each other, and that in different contexts, that has different kinds of implications, right? So a lot of what I see on Facebook, right, and this, probably many of you too, is discussions of kind of just public life. So, how do Muslims kind of move throughout their communities? I remember after the election seeing a meme passed around that was sort of telling people how to respond if they saw a Muslim woman being harassed in public, for example. So we see a lot of these kinds of examples, and I think people are aware that, if something like that happens near me, I should, say something or do something, right? I think this study reminds us of the ways that a lot of this is very institutionalized and has these longer-term implications and very real implications for people's economic integration, for example, and their ability to be socially mobile in society. And so I don't know what policy interventions there would be, except to say that I think more resources need to be devoted not just to focusing on the ways that Muslims face discrimination, but the ways that Arab Americans face discrimination more generally. Kind of going back to Michelle's comment about how, the Air Force One comment, right? Like that Arab Americans have faced discrimination for a long time. And I don't know that that's necessarily always recognized because so much of the public conversation is about Muslims in particular. But there are many Arab Americans, most Arab Americans are Christian in the US, and they're facing discrimination for being Arab, and that's something that doesn't necessarily get discussed. And I'm not sure there's as many resources among nonprofits, for example, devoted to some of those issues. So I think that's one potential implication or policy level of the paper. In terms of the research on Spain, as we all know, research is kind of a living organism and changes. And the project that I was working on with Abby Oster, who is at the University of Barcelona, he unfortunately did not find any results in his study in Spain. There's a bunch of reasons that we think that might be the case. And if we continue to do the research for longer, perhaps we would find something else.
I'll just try to interrupt you. What do you
So he did the same study, but did not find any significant differences between groups in Spain. But we think that part of the reason for that is that he had a much lower overall callback rate. So for this study, overall, 16% of the candidates were called back. And that's pretty standard among audit studies in the US. In Spain, I think their callback rate was 7%. So out of all the applications that they submitted, 7% of those applicants were called back. The economy in Spain is not great. There's very high rates of unemployment. So, I mean, that's probably the reason that those callback rates were so much lower. But because of that, it meant that he needed twice the sample size to be able to find any kinds of significant results. So, so for now, I think that part of the research is on hold because it didn't seem like there were any interesting results, and then we'd have to do so much more work to see if something came out of that. So I'm not sure what the implications of that are. I mean, we know that Muslims in Spain face discrimination. It's just not clear from the study what's going on there.
You have different parts of the country that you were taking these samples from. Did you do any analysis between different parts of the country?
We did, yeah. And we did not find any significant differences between different parts of the country in callback rates for Muslims. In callback rates for Arab Americans, the only regional difference that we found was a difference in callback rates for the North versus the West, which did not align with my hypothesis at all, because I sort of thought, like, oh, if people are being called back less, it's because people have more negative attitudes towards Muslims, and that's probably going to be in more Republican areas of the country, because we know Republicans express more negative attitudes towards Muslims. But we think of both the Northeast and the West as being progressive areas, so I don't know why that difference exists, but we found a lower callback rate for Arab Americans in the West compared to the North. That was the only regional difference we found.
So I have a few comments. One, building on what Nandia asked you, with your study of Black Muslims, are you going to distinguish between, for example, West African sounding names that might lead people to think that Africans are immigrants So like Mamadou Sembène versus, Brian McIntosh or something like that. That's one question. About the Airbnb, I wonder if you should be looking at the hosts, not just the guests. I'm an avid Airbnb user myself, especially because many communities seem to be moving towards the instant book, which I would have thought would eliminate the ability of your study to gauge responses. And then a question, building on what Will said and connecting to what he said. Will pointed to variable sites of discrimination that you mentioned, and I was thinking about that, and also he said something about different discourses of Trump, and I was thinking about misogynistic discourses at the national level and the potential correlation with what you found in attitudes towards women and passivity versus agency.
So for Airbnb, the names that we're using are the same, are all names that have Arab origins, or North African origins. So, and the reason that we're doing that, again, is to be able to more easily compare our Black Muslim guests with our Arab Muslim guests. So those are the names that we're using for that. For the hosts, we're collecting data on all of the hosts who we send inquiries to for Airbnb, and collecting data based on their photographs, because hosts have to use photographs as well. We'll use Mechanical Turk users to have several different people identify what they think the racial identity of this host is, and then based on 2 or 3 responses, take whatever it seems like people are agreeing on, and that'll give us the racial identity of the host. So that way we'll kind of be able to have that information and see whether that shapes who's getting called back and who isn't. So we are collecting that information. What we're not doing is creating fictitious profiles for hosts that people might ask about staying at their place. So we're not doing that. I just felt like it was going to be too many different moving parts. But we are going to collect information on the hosts that we're sending inquiries to. The instant book. So I have do other people use Airbnb? Anybody? Yep. So instant book is something that's becoming much more popular, and basically the way that works is that you can send an inquiry to a host, and then they can just instantly approve you and just say all you have to do is enter your credit card information, basically. So it's a very quick way for, and a way that Airbnb has actually very explicitly tried to address past concerns about discrimination.
And some places are almost entirely instant book, like Brussels.
Yep. So that is something that initially we were concerned about, except that what we have found is that people still will send us a message about it.
Yeah.
So for example, we'll have people that say hey, I just sent you an instant book, invitation, so feel free to just click on it. Or people will, send us the instant book, but then they'll also tell us some more information, like, why are you coming to our city? How long are you going to be here? Are you coming alone? And we'll ask all of these kind of follow-up questions that they didn't necessarily ask of other candidates or other guests. So it seems like there's still some interesting data to be captured, even with the instant book becoming more prominent.
Also, they can reject the instant book.
Yeah.
Or cancel the reservation.
The owner can just say, oh, I messed up the calendar. And so it's kind of the same thing, only quicker. Yeah.
We're beginning to head towards the end of our timer, so do let me know if you have a question. We have time for a few more.
Yeah, I have one quick question, but it's kind of building off Professor Sharkey's question regarding the names of areas. I'm wondering how comfortable we can conclude that this is an anti-Arab sentiment versus an anti-brown Muslim sentiment specifically. And obviously when you're getting Philadelphia, Yusuf Ahmed is that's just a black Muslim pianist's name. It's very famous. So that gets more complicated in Philadelphia, but broadly speaking, a lot of these names are just brown Muslim names. And people might assign that an Arab moniker, but they're an Arab identity, but they might really mean just more broadly speaking, South Asia to Morocco. And so I'm wondering how much, like, are you putting in tests like they're part of the Arab Student Association at their college or something like that to kind of clarify that it's Arab, or is it really just the name that you're using to signify Arab?
Yep, it's just the name. I mean, just to answer the question, I think all of what you said is very useful and good commentary. But yeah, it's just the name. We didn't include any other information signifying or signaling that the person was Arab other than the name. Yep.
There's a lot of good scholarship that's pretty current and that would use brown Muslim as a category for that. And there's definitely problems with that, but that might kind of resolve this, the problems that you're running into in terms of like where you draw identity markers and lines, because that covers a broader umbrella. And in North America, people really, I think, oftentimes deal with brown Muslim more than they deal with Arab and South Asian.
Yeah, it's a helpful comment, and you know, I'll definitely think about that some. I actually did spend some time considering whether to change the terminology being used in the paper away from using the term Arab to using something broader, because of all of the points that you've all raised, which I think are good points. One of the reasons that I ended up deciding not to do that was because of the test that I did with the MTurk users, where people were saying when they saw the names like Arab or Middle Eastern. So it gave me more confidence that whether those are correct terms or not, that was the way that a lot of Americans were thinking about it.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
I wanted to hear about the other projects that I heard someone mention about trying to look at Hindu and Buddhist congregations or Hindu and Buddhist experiences in the same area. I just wanted to know what sort of procedure and method we're planning to use there, and what sort of hypothesis we're operating with this project.
Yeah, sure. So that project is in sort of a different area. My prior book was on immigration activism in faith-based organizing groups. And one of the things that I found in that project was that even though the groups identified as interfaith, they were usually just Christian and Jewish activists. And that's pretty typical if you look at a census of faith-based organizing groups. And afterwards, I thought to myself, you know, I think probably there are other things that are happening in Buddhist and Hindu and Muslim communities where there's a lot of immigrants. I bet they're doing stuff around immigration, but they're just not doing this, right? So what is it that they're doing and how are they getting involved? And at least in sociology, there's just not very much known about contemporary activism in these communities. And in sociology, a lot of the research on religious activism assumes that the congregation is what's important, that that's the central agent of mobilization for people. And a lot of these other traditions are just not as congregational, even in the US context, but certainly outside of it. So that was really what drove the motivation for the project, was to better understand, you know, what are Buddhists and Hindus and Muslims doing to create social change in their communities? Are they getting involved through their local, you know, congregation or temple or mosque? Or are they getting involved through some other route? And what does that activism look like? So that's what that project focuses on. I'm doing interviews and some limited ethnography for that project.
I guess for our last question, we'll turn to Rogers.
Well, this is a less than profound question, but only exposes my ignorance. But it does go to the nature of the project. I'm familiar in political science with some of the methodological debates over audit studies, a lot of which are sharply critical about whether you can ever be very confident of your findings, because you can't really be sure what they're reacting to and what you think are identical resumes. Now, some of those have to do with in-person audits where there might be greater opportunity for other factors to come into play than when you're doing these correspondence audits that you're doing. But you know, you obviously have confidence in the methodology to pursue it. But precisely because I'd like to be able to appeal to your findings, Can you give me a sense of the state of the debate over how reliable this kind of research is?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So Dawn Teal, who I think is maybe coming to dinner tonight, so I'm curious to talk with her about this, published an edited volume recently that was precisely about this, that was about kind of debates about field experiments, which is just kind of another word for audit studies, and their utility, the potential problems with them, the potential pitfalls.
Quite the same.
That's true.
Category, but go ahead.
That's true. But yeah, so I'd be interested to hear her thoughts about this as well. But I know that certainly there has been some criticism of the studies, and like you said, especially with in-person audits, because when a person goes to an interview, it's much harder to control for things like body language or style of dress and things like that. So the idea behind doing a correspondence audit for me, in addition to it being easier and cheaper, was that you can control for more than you can in in-person audits. I think people have done a really good job today raising some questions about whether there still might be things that employers are or aren't seeing on resumes that we can't really account for. And yes, I mean that's it's a flaw or just a weakness of this type of design. But for me, one of the reasons that I have confidence in it is that I think it still gets us closer than most other methods to understanding and measuring what's going on in situations like this. So even though it's not a perfect method, it's about as close as you can get for measuring things like this. So.
Can I just ask one quick time? Sure. How did you decide which resumes to send to which?
Randomly.
Was there any?
Just randomly,
So
yeah.
there was no built-in bias about a Starbucks job, you're going to send the white male?
Yep, no, we just used a random number generator. So each new job that would come up, we would just randomly generate a number and send that resume that was associated with that number.
Okay, well, thank you for the paper and